Okay, great. I think we're gonna kick off, and people might join throughout. And like I said before, please feel free to drop things in the chat for me if you have any questions. There are no dumb questions in brewing. It doesn't even have to be related to what we're talking about, but obviously it's best if it is. And I don't also always know what you've attended before. So I pretty much enter these webinars with the assumption that this is your first webinar, but I will be revisiting some of the things we spoke of before. And I'm trying to assume as little as possible about your knowledge of all grain brewing, especially using Brew-in-a-Bag, which is the method we're going to cover today. But please feel free to ask as we go along. So today we're going to look at brewing your first all grain beer, or one of your first. In previous webinars, I spoke about different styles of beer, which may be useful to start with. And the APA, the American Pale Ale, is really one of my favorites to teach people how to brew with. And we'll cover why I say that in a little while. Just quickly about me, if you didn't know, I created the beginnerbrewer.com website a couple of years ago, around about 2003, I think. And since then, I've been working in the brewing industry on and off in different capacities. I also write a regular column for On Tap magazine. And, it's for my sins. It's great fun. I kind of enjoy it. Yeah, so that's some of the things I do out there in the industry. I work with a lot of craft brewers on marketing and recipe formulation and process formulation. And I still love homebrewing. Even though I get an opportunity every now and again to work in commercial breweries and brew on large systems, there is still something really special for me about making beer at home in small quantities. And something which you will learn as you become more experienced in this hobby is that it is quite possible for homebrewers to occasionally brew a beer which is really quite world class in quality, and perhaps even better than a commercial brewer can achieve, mostly because homebrewers don't have to worry too much about cost or replicating their recipes. You can put saffron in your beer if you want to as a home brewer, because it's not going to cost you thousands of rand, because you're not brewing thousands of liter of beer. Whereas a commercial brewer would really have to justify that carefully to the business owner before they can do stuff like that. So that's actually one of the great things about homebrewing, is you can occasionally produce something which no commercial brewer will ever be able to produce. Alrighty, let's move on. Relax and brew some beer, and remember that beer wants to be made. I think no more is this more apparent than in all grain brewing using things like Brew-in-a-Bag, where it really becomes very obvious that beer is sort of out there in nature, ready to be made almost accidentally. And you'll see, hopefully, as we go along, why I say that. But really importantly, it's not that complicated. I actually think, in terms of the alcoholic things you can produce at home, things like mead and wine and distilling, if you want to get into that sort of stuff, beer is the simplest of all the things you can produce, really, in so many ways. Whereas distilling for me is still, I'm kind of slowly getting into it, but it's a little bit Greek to me still today. And winemaking sometimes also seems pretty complicated. Beer is not that complicated. And that is perhaps why it is the very first commercially produced alcoholic beverage we know of in human history, other than mead. So that says something. Just to recap something of where we are in this whole sort of endeavor, to review that there are three different kinds of categories of beer. So you have ales, lagers, and hybrids. Those are the three main types of beer, large categories. And ales really are the ones which most homebrewers will really connect to and brew more often than not. They are, to some extent, the easiest because they don't require as much refrigeration when they are fermented. And I mean, hybrids also can be quite accessible as well. Lagers are probably the least accessible style of beer for home brewers because it requires such careful temperature control. And in your warmer climates like here in South Africa, it becomes problematic unless you have a modified fridge or a very expensive jacketed fermenter of some kind. I mean, you can do the swamp cool method where you put your fermenter in a container of water with ice. That's just high labor and can go wrong. So ales really, fortunately, is the one for us. And also, fortunately, there are literally hundreds of different styles of ales which you can brew. So you'll never run out of things to brew, even if you just brew ales for the rest of your career as a brewer. Just to ask the question again, what makes a beer easy? And I discussed that last time. And the American Pale Ale, which we will be covering today, really meets all of these criteria, I think. So there's simple brewing in fermentation schedules, very little need for temperature control in any season, really, because it remains pretty well at low and room temperatures. So you can brew in winter and summer. It is less likely to show common errors, not necessarily because of darker malts in this case, but because you're using quite a bit of hops in the APA style. And simple ingredients, which we'll cover, and easy to judge. So APAs are great tasting beers. I mean, it's very obvious that you've hit it correctly because it's a good tasting beer. There are no subtle sort of flavor profiles to look for necessarily, and there are definitely quite a few available commercial examples. The APA style is one of the more popular ones amongst craft brewers in South Africa, so it's reasonably easy to find some. I think in my next slide I'll show you some examples. So here's a little bit of what you're trying to aim at. It's always useful to understand the style you're trying to brew and what you're trying to hit. Not because it's in any shape or form not allowed to brew outside of a particular style. No one's going to arrest you. There's no style police out there driving, the streets of the city with a black van, kidnapping people who haven't followed a brew style. But what it does do for the brewer is it gives you something to aim at. It gives you a framework with which to test your skills, to measure your progress as a brewer, to know how you're improving your ability to brew beer. And it gives you a starting point for your own invention. So, nothing stops you from making, you're kind of making up your own style. There's still lots of spaces between styles for inventive brewers to exploit. But in many ways, like so many disciplines and art forms, it's useful to know the rules before you break them. That's more likely to produce something interesting from an experimental point of view than something which is going to be undrinkable. And that's really why brewing to a style can be useful for you as a beginning brewer and as a more experienced one as well. So we're trying to aim at an APA at a well-balanced ale. It's balanced not in the sense that there's a perfect balance between malts and hops and so on, but that there is a good interplay, a good weaving of flavor between your very hoppy flavors of the American hops, which you'll use in the APA, and a good solid backbone of malt to support that hoppiness. And that sort of also teaches you how styles operate. So if you were to dial back the malt character of an APA, you would move that beer into an IPA territory, an India Pale Ale territory, where the hops become far more prominent because there is less malt to counterbalance the bitterness of the hops. If you had to up the malt content of an APA's recipe, then you would move it more towards the side of an English Pale Ale or some of your more German style beers, where the malt is really in the foreground. And your English Pale Ales are generally, that's what distinguishes them from the American Pale Ale. They tend to be more malt forward, less hoppy than the American style. Color is really important as well because it's part of the style. You're trying to aim for a specific color. It's all part of beer appreciation, is to aim for and hit a particular color. And American Pale Ales tend to be sort of pale gold to amber. That's the color you're aiming at. So they're not as pale as a lager, for instance, but they're not as dark as something like a amber ale or a porter. And they generally should be crystal clear. I'm a great proponent of producing really clear beer. You can, as a home brewer, definitely create crystal clear beer without filtering. That's not always possible if you're a commercial brewer for various reasons. But for a home brewer, you don't have to filter your beer to create beer you can read through. And it's a joy to produce a very crystal clear beer. If you dry hop, and APAs do call for dry hopping sometimes, you will naturally create a bit of a haze. But it's more of a clear haze, if that makes sense. It's not murky. It's still clear, and it's obvious that there's something in there which creates the haze, which in this case will be the hops. Your malt flavors you're going to aim for here is toasty, bread-like, slightly caramel, not too much. Again, if it's too much caramel, if it tastes sugary, you're more in the territory of a British ale or an American amber ale, which is another style, which really foregrounds the caramel flavors. And then for hop flavors, we're really aiming for the classic American hop flavors, which you get from Cascade and Centennial and Chinook and those sort of sea, hops. So grapefruit, lemon, pine cone, cut grass. Those are all good flavors to aim for. And that's going to be a very prominent flavor in the APA because, as I said before, it is a bit of a hop forward beer style. And then the yeast contribution is relatively low. There's not a lot of flavor coming out of the yeast in an American pale ale. That's why the American yeasts used for this style tend to be very clean fermentation yeasts. They don't produce a lot of esters, not a lot of fruitiness, but they are very high attenuating yeast. Now, that is just a very complicated word for saying to what extent does this yeast ferment all of the available sugar in the beer. High attenuation means the yeast ferments almost all of it. Low attenuation means not so much. American ale yeast are high attenuation, so they finish dry. In other words, they remove a lot of the sugar in the beer, producing obviously alcohol and CO2, and that results in a kind of a dryish or semi-dry finish. Okay, so that's the sort of yeast contribution which you're aiming for, and then moderate carbonation, not as low as something like a British ale yeast, but or rather British ale, sorry, but definitely a reasonable fizz to the beer. It doesn't have to, there shouldn't be flat. And in an IPA, we're looking at a moderate level of ABV, so somewhere between 4.5% to 6% alcohol by volume, and that's pretty common for most APAs. In fact, the one we're going to go through is more in the sort of 5% level. Alrighty, so let's move on. Just remember, please, to switch off your video and so on if you can. Otherwise, it might just interfere with the recording. Alrighty. Some commercial examples. Here in South Africa, we have a very good commercial example called the Cape Pale Ale by Jack Black. I'm canning it now. I'm hoping to enjoy one later today after the session. It's one of my favorite beers right now in South Africa. It's very close, actually, to Sierra Nevada, which is on the right-hand side there, which is sort of it's the paradigm example of a pale ale. If you study to become a beer judge and using the system like the BJCP, this will often be seen as the paradigm example for American pale ale if you learn what it tastes like. And having had the luck of doing so quite a few times, I can honestly say that Jack Black CPA is very close to the Sierra Nevada Pale Ale. And I don't think they would mind me saying so because that's considered to be one of the best pale ales out there. And you can see it from the picture, the color. That's really the classic sort of light gold going onto amber type of color we're aiming for. And a nice crisp white head, good foam retention, always a good sign for a good beer. Okay, let's get right into how we're going to make our American Pale Ale and what we need to do to get there. And again, this assumes that you don't know too much about Brew-in-a-Bag or how to do this, and we're going to take you through each step at a time. First things first is you're going to need to prepare for the day. You're going to need to know what equipment you have to have and what are the ingredients. Okay, so let's first look at the ingredients you'll have to purchase beforehand. Okay, so starting with our base and specialty malts. Firstly, they have to be milled. Okay, so you're either going to have a mill yourself, or you can ask for pre-milled grains from your homebrew shop supplier, but they have to be milled. You can't do all grain brewing with unmilled grains. So our base malt, the malt which is going to produce most of the fermentable sugar and a lot of the character of the malt will be pale malt. Two-row pale malt, it's also called pale ale malt sometimes. They're not always exactly the same. Pale ale malt's often of Belgian and German origin, whereas your regular pale malts come from England and South Africa and America and so on. But any kind of pale malt or pale ale malt will be just fine for this recipe. Now, this is a 19-liter recipe. You can obviously scale it down to smaller quantities. And if you're interested in that, I can help you out later on. But for most home brewers, they will brew a 19-liter batch. It's a lot of beer, by the way. I mean, that's, I don't know, if my math serves me right, it's about 50 bottles of beer, depending on the size of the bottle. So it's a fair quantity. And yeah, so anything which says it's pale malt will do. I wouldn't use Pilsner malt. So Pilsner malt is the other big category of base malts. But for a American pale ale, Pilsner malt is a little bit too grainy. It introduces a little bit too much of a grainy flavor for a pale malt for me, and it's not really the right malt. You can use Pilsner malt very successfully in many other styles other than Pilsner. But for the APA, I would stick with something like a pale malt or a pale ale malt. So we're going to have about 2.7 kgs of that, and then 1.5 kgs of light Munich malt. This is a pretty good principle, by the way, for creating your own APA recipe. The relationship of sort of 2 to 1 of pale malt to Munich malt is a good starting point for any APA. Lots and lots of different APAs are brewed using that sort of 2 to 1 principle of pale malt to light Munich malt. You can use dark Munich malt, but it is going to make the beer darker than required, and it might introduce too much of a biscuity flavor to your beer, pushing it into something more like an English ale. Your light Munich malts are a little bit better for that. They hit the color right. A Munich malt also is a base malt, but it is kilned, so it's a pale malt which is kilned for some time, which gives it a darker color and more of the toasted bread notes. So this is where your toasty kind of, really like toast, like toasted bread flavors are going to come from for your APA. And this is also the nice counterbalance to the hoppy flavor which we're going to produce. So again, depending on the homebrew supply store, they will call these things different things, but usually it will be something like Munich Light or Munich 1. If it's a Weyermann product, they have Munich 1 and Munich 2. Munich 1 is the light one. So you can just ask your homebrew supply store for the lighter Munich malt they have. You can also, by the way, substitute that for Vienna malt. So Vienna malt is even lighter than Munich malt and will do in a pinch. So that's a useful substitute as well. And then we're going to add a little bit of crystal malt, a little bit of caramel malt, also a light variety, anything from sort of 40 to 60 Lauberbond in color. If it's a Weyermann product, that would be Car Munich 2 or Car Munich 1. Probably Car Munich 1 actually. And you can see there, it's not a very large quantity of caramel malt. We're just adding it there for a little bit of color and a touch of caramel sweetness for the beer. So only about 300 grams of that. And that's it. It's a very simple grain bill. Nothing special about that. You're going to mull that, you're going to mix it all together, and you're going to mash that together. The hop schedule, a little bit more complicated because it is a hop-forward beer. So at 50 minutes, now remember, when we brew, we count backwards in time. It's a bit weird, I know, but you'll get used to it. It's actually very simple. It shows how, sometimes us brewers are a bit simple people. We don't want to think too much sometimes when we work. So the 50 minutes and the counting backwards really is because we're looking at a timer. You're going to have a timer going as you brew. And 50 minutes simply means that when that timer says 50, you're adding your hops. And you're going to start it at 60 because this is a 60-minute boil. So 10 minutes into that boil, your timer is going to say 50. And then you're going to add 15 grams of Centennial hops. And at 10% AA is the alpha acid content of Centennial generally. It's quite a high bitterness hop. 10% is a high alpha acid content. You can replace it with other hops which have similar alpha acid contents. That's really sort of why I put it there, so that if you're battling to find Centennial. But these hops also, and I've made the recipes with that in mind, are the more common hops out there. I mean, they are grown in tremendously large quantities in America and increasingly also in Europe and other places. So it shouldn't be difficult to find it in any good homebrew supply store. Okay. And so, yeah, but 50 minutes, so we're not starting at 60 minutes. I quite like producing beers with a 50-minute bitterness addition. I've just found really good results from that, both in home brewing and commercial brewing. 60 minutes sometimes a little bit long. And then at 20 minutes, we're now adding, if Centennial is going to add a lot of the bitterness, the flavor component of the hops is really going to come from your later addition. So at 20 minutes, We're going to add 20 grams of Cascade. You can see there a much less bitter hop. Produces lots of really beautiful grapefruit flavors, bright grapefruit flavors. It's a lovely hop. I love this stuff. And then at 5 minutes, we're going to add a mixture of Cascade and Centennial again. And this is quite common in many APA recipes as well, to use some of the bittering hop in a flavor and aroma addition as well. Just because some hops are very bitter doesn't mean that they haven't also got lots of good flavor. And Centennial is a great example of that. It is very, very bitter. It adds a lot of bitterness, but it also has tremendously rich and strong citrus and foresty sort of pine cone flavors to add as well. So you can imagine those things are going to mix really well. Your grapefruit flavors with your citrus flavors, with your pine flavors, just have a lovely depth for an APA. And then finally, we're going to do some Whirlpool hopping. An increasingly more popular thing to do, especially in hoppy beers, is to add your hops to the Whirlpool, and I'll explain that a little bit later. But it means that you extract almost no bitterness from the hop, but only flavor and aroma if you add it to the Whirlpool, and it really just bumps up that hoppiness a little bit more. And it's also kind of a soft hoppiness which it adds. So it's a very pleasant flavor and mouthfeel which it produces. Yeast, we're going to stick to an American ale yeast. Any American ale yeast will do. A common one here in South Africa is the Lallemand products of dry yeast, USO5, but you can use anything. You can use a liquid yeast as long as it is an American ale strain. And then additional ingredients you're going to need to get is something called Irish moss, which is a finings. This is my favorite finings to use. It's a fining you add to the boil, not post-boil. There are other finings, and finings are used to clarify beer. And other finings you can use post-boil. I'm not a fan of those, mostly because it's generally, risks contamination. And also it's often too late to add it then after boil. Because a lot of what you're trying to do when you clarify beer is to break up protein. And the best way to break up protein in beer is to boil the wort. And that's the best opportunity you have to remove a lot of protein from beer. And Irish moss helps you do that. So Irish moss is just a substance derived from seaweed. Doesn't taste like seaweed or anything. It doesn't make your beer taste fishy. You add it in very small quantities, and it binds to proteins in the wort when you boil it. And it just sort of drops it down to the bottom of the kettle. So it just helps clarify your beer. And also useful to have on hand, even though we are brewing all grain beer here, is some dried malt extract, DME, because that is sort of the Swiss Army knife of brewing. It's really useful to have available because you may not hit all the numbers, for instance. You may have a little bit of a weak extraction during mash, and you may want to add some DME just to get to the right number. So always have some spare available to you. It's a really useful tip. And freshness is key here. Just like any food product, if you're going to, I can't think of a great example right now, but even if you're going to cook a nice, spaghetti bolognese and you're using, spaghetti which came out in the 1940s, it's not going to taste great. And it's similar with beer. If your ingredients are not fresh, if your yeast is expired and you're taking malt out of your brewing cupboard, which has been there for 2 years, stored in an open bag, don't expect to make a good beer. So you've got to taste your ingredients, especially your malts, to see if they still taste good, if they're not, moldy, or if they don't taste sort of oxidized. Obviously, you can't taste yeast or hops. Or you can taste hops, but I wouldn't recommend it. So last time you will do that raw. But, try and use fresh ingredients. Then what are the water volumes and temperatures we're aiming for? So in a brew-in-a-bag mash schedule, you're using the full volume of water. So you're never going to add additional water really, other than just trying to dilute, the wort if you need to. So in many different kinds of mashing and many different kind of all grain processes, you will start with some of your water and then add later as you sparge. In other words, as you wash the sugars from the grain bed. In Brew-in-a-Bag, we use firstly a type of mash called single infusion mashing, which means we are only aiming at one temperature. And we also do not do any actual sparging, which is we do not really wash the grain bed free from wort in any meaningful kind of way. So as a result, it's the simplest possible way of making all grain beer, and you're going to start with all the water you're going to have. And because grain absorbs water, we're going to start with more water than we need. So remember, we're aiming for a sort of a 19-liter batch at the end. So we're going to start with 27 liters of brew-ready water, so water which doesn't have chlorine or chloramine in it. You're going to heat that full volume to 72 degrees Celsius. Why? Because we're aiming for a mash-in temperature of around 66.7. And because your malts are at room temperature, they will lower the temperature of the water you put them in. And so you're always going to heat to a little bit higher than you need. Okay, so that's what you're going to do to begin with. That will result in 22 liters of wort. So when you extract the grains from your brew pot, they will take quite a bit of liquid with them. And so you will end up with 22 liters, and you still need more than 19 because obviously you're going to now boil it, which means you're going to end up with 20 liters of wort eventually, which you're going to put into the fermenter. That's 1 liter more than you need, because when you bottle, you'll lose around about a liter of liquid from the bottom of that fermenter, which you're going to chuck away. And you're going to obviously end up then with 19 liters. So you're always going to sort of step it down as you go along. Hope that makes sense. By the way, if you have questions as we go along, please post them in the chat. I'm happy to answer them at the end of the session. Don't feel shy. Okay, some of the equipment you're going to need. Well, you're going to need a stock pot, pictured here. Stock pots are taller than they are wide. That's what makes them a stock pot. Nice thick base. Either aluminum or stainless steel will do. And because of the volume of water we just mentioned, you clearly need something with quite of a big capacity. So at least 35 to 45 liters capacity, because you can imagine if I'm going to add 27 liters of water and add around 5 kilograms of malt, right, that displacement alone is going to be more than 30 liters of displacement. And you don't want, the liquid to spill all over the place. That will not make your day. So you need a rather large stock pot. And then obviously, because of the volume of liquid, a normal stovetop burner is not going to do. You're going to need a high pressure gas burner with a high pressure regulator, as pictured here. Okay, that's really the way you're going to have to do it. And that's really important. Because you're aiming for a very vigorous boil, so you cannot simmer the beer. So if you use a low pressure gas burner, with that amount of liquid, you're probably likely to only produce a kind of a simmer. And that's really, why it's important. Okay. You want a vigorous rolling boil. Alrighty, and then the obvious one, since it is brew-in-a-bag, is you need the bag, right? And it's made out of voile, as pictured here. It's that fabric you make curtaining from. You can make it yourself. You can buy it from most homebrew stores. I'm actually currently working with a producer to produce some and hopefully being able to make it available to people who visit Beginner Brewer, because I'm not always that happy with the quality of the ones available. But you can certainly have one made if you know someone, or if you yourself are very handy with stitching things up. And that's really the main part of Brew-in-a-Bag, is the bag, right? And if it's made properly, this bag will last you a very long time. I've only had one bag break on me in the many years I've been brewing. And the other one is probably now in its 5th year of use, and it's still going strong. So if it's made properly, you can keep it for a long, long time. And then some additional gear you'll need. These are really important things. I wouldn't say they are nice to have. These are really have to haves. If you're going to start doing all grain brewing and brew-in-a-bag brewing, you're going to have to measure stuff. Okay, measurement is sort of important in brewing. I know there are brewers out there who like to eyeball things and sort of guesstimate it, but I've very rarely seen that work. If you're going to eyeball things and go near enough, then you're also going to have a near enough beer, which is not going to be great. So kitchen scale, obviously, sort of important to measure out your ingredients. And then other measurements you're going to need. You're going to need to measure the gravity of your beer. So you're going to need a beer hydrometer or a refractometer. Either one will do. There's obviously a massive cost difference between the two. Refractometers are quite expensive. They mostly, can be up to $1,000 for the more expensive versions, whereas the hydrometer is not that expensive. And then some form of thermometer, which can, a liquid thermometer, obviously, so it can measure liquid. The ones pictured there are quite and I use both of them. The glass thermometers are very accurate. They use spirit or alcohol level for the, they don't use mercury anymore. That stuff's hectically dangerous. I wouldn't use a mercury thermometer even if you have one from back in the day. But the glass ones are very accurate. But nowadays also the electronic instant read thermometers, which I've pictured there on the right, are just as good. And what's nice about them is they instant read. So they give you an instantaneous temperature read. You don't have to hang around with it too long. Okay, so those are some of the really important measurement devices. And then some other bits and pieces you're going to need is a colander, similar to the one I've pictured there. Something you can place into a bucket, which is the second bucket over there, to drain the bag fully. So that's a nice thing. I mean, you don't absolutely have to have this, but to be complete, I thought I would include this in the webinar. And then also a mash paddle. So that's any kind of spoon with holes in it. This is a custom-made one I'm showing here, but you can literally go and buy the largest wooden spoon you can find at a supply store of some kind and drill some holes into it. That's really all it needs. I wouldn't use a metal spoon, by the way. Obviously you get metal spoons which have holes in it, slotted spoons and so on. I wouldn't use it for a simple reason that your Voile bag, although strong, is vulnerable to tearing and cutting. And a metal spoon could tear and cut that bag because you are going to be stirring your mash. And so what you want is a wooden or a plastic spoon with nice rounded edges, nothing which is going to cut, the delicate fabric of a Voile bag. And the holes really are there so that you can move it easily through the grains in the mash. If it were not like that, it would be a little bit more effortful. Not impossible. You can really just use a very big plastic spoon, for instance, and you'll be fine. Okay, but if you want to be fancy and impress your friends with cool tools, mash paddle is the way to go. Alrighty. What are we going to do on brew day? That's important to figure out. So now we've got all our equipment, we've got our ingredients, we've checked everything, they're fresh. Goes without saying, I'm not going to spend too much time on the sterilizing parts of things because I covered that in previous webinars, but I will mention it where it's really, really important. But you're obviously going to have some kind of sterilizing fluid and so on. Then you're going to have cleaned everything. So cleaning and sterilizing are not the same thing. Cleaning means you remove visible dirt. Sterilizing is you remove the invisible microbes and other things which can ruin your beer. So it goes without saying that you start with everything being nice and clean. Let's look at the mash. And I'm going to take it step by step by step. So first you're going to do what's called mashing in. So now you've heated that water to a specific volume. And mashing in means I'm adding my grains into this liquid. And in Brew-in-a-Bag, you're going to obviously put your bag into the pot as is shown here before. You're not going to do it necessarily while you heat the water, though. That's not a good idea. And the reason for that simply is if you have a gas burner going, the heat which goes along the side of the pot will start burning the Voile bag. And the Voile bag is not completely heat resistant, okay? It's not made to be heated to much higher than, 70 degrees Celsius or so before it starts melting. And it's not great. So you want to put the bag in at the end. When you've reached the right temperature, you're going to put your bag in as shown here. If you're worried about it falling into the pot, you can always secure it with some binder clips around the edges. That's perfectly fine. But if your bag's big enough, you can just fold it over like shown here. And then you're going to add slowly the grains as depicted here. And all of the grains mixed in. You don't have to do them, pale ale malt, then Munich, then you just mix them all together and start putting them in. And I thought I would give you some things I've learned over the years as we go along, things I really feel are important to get it right. So the first thing is to add slowly. Okay, if you're going to take 5 kilograms of grain and just chuck it into the pot, not only is the water going to splash everywhere, but you're going to get large dough balls forming. So if you add it slowly and then stir it with your mash paddle as you add it, you won't get as much balls of dry dough forming. The reason why you want to break up those balls is that you want maximum contact between the water and your grain, because that will allow for the enzymatic processes to convert starch into sugar. And it needs that sort of space between the grains filled with water so that the enzymes can move around and convert your starch into sugar. Measuring your temperature at the end, to see whether you've hit the right temperature. Now, normally you would have. I mean, if you've measured it correctly and you're at 72 degrees Celsius, by the time you've put in all your grains, it will be at the right temperature. That's the whole point of heating it up. But if it's very different, usually it might be very, a bit lower. You may want to heat slowly to the right temperature, but it's not normally that important. Okay, so because the temperature ranges required for mashing is relatively wide, and we'll get to that just now. But it's always a good practice to measure your temperature because it gives you an understanding of how your beer is going to turn out, right? If it's very high, for instance, you may find that your beer has more body, less dry finish. If it's very low, it's going to be the opposite. It's going to be a lighter bodied beer with a much drier finish. Okay. Now, in our particular mash, we are trying to aim for the middle. So that's where we're going. And when I say 3-point measuring temperature, there's 3 zones of temperature in any mash tun, which your stock pot has now become. There's the top, which is almost just water, okay, which is going to be, 1 temperature. Then there's going to be the middle of the pot, which is going to be sort of a slurry of molten water, which has its own temperature. And then at the bottom is where the grain bed lies, and that's going to have its own temperature. So when we're measuring the temperature, we're kind of taking 3 readings and averaging them out to see what is the mash in temperature. Okay, so that's an important. So if you're only measuring one part of that, sort of complex arrangement, you may get a wrong idea of what your mash temperature might be. And then finally, you're going to close the lid. That's important. Don't forget, right? It keeps the heat in. You're not going to add any heat from that point onwards. You're not going to keep it on a low flame. The lowest possible flame will still eventually start boiling that mash, and it's going to ruin everything, okay? Because over a certain temperature, your enzymes die out. They denature, and they no longer convert starch into sugar. So you could end up with almost no sugar and effectively not have wort, which you can use to create beer if you keep heat onto it. And like I said, you're going to measure your water at 72, and you're aiming for that 66.7 Goldilocks zone, which is useful for a medium-bodied beer like an APA. Okay, so it's a good mix of non-fermentable sugar and fermentable sugar we're trying to aim at. Okay, there's a picture of the infusion. So that's step 2. That's now where we've put the lid on. This is a smaller batch, by the way, just so that you know why it's on my stovetop here. This is a 9-liter batch, so for that I can use my stovetop. But essentially the same story if it's a 19-liter batch. And I've put the lid on there. And now what are you going to do during this period? This is actually sort of the period where you're probably going to start doing other stuff in preparation for the rest of the day, rather than being very actively involved. Because you're going to be mashing this for 75 minutes. Okay, so just basically leaving it well alone for 75 minutes with a few exceptions. Okay, so you are going to stir it a little bit, 2 to 3 times during this period. So make up your mind where you want to do it, set a timer, and then when the timer goes, you can open the lid, stir gently, very gently with your mash paddle. You don't want to whisk the stuff. You don't want to, you're not trying to create any kind of major turbulence because there is a risk of introducing oxygen into the mash, which could affect your flavor later on. So you just want to gently kind of just again make sure that all the grains have equal contact with the water, that the temperature of the water is sort of equally distributed across the stock pot. That's why you do it. In a commercial brewing facility, you will often see their mash tuns have these giant rakes which sort of circulate through the mash to do the same thing. And the reason you're doing this, as I said, is to improve contact and to improve the surface area which the enzymes have to operate on. And that will ultimately improve the mash efficiency. So it will improve the amount of starches converted into sugar for the final beer. Okay, so it can generally be a good thing for your beer to do so. And all you're going to do is just measure your temperature if you like when stirring, and that can be things you take note of. You will find, depending on the season, if it's winter, for instance, the temperature will drop more rapidly than in summer, where it sort of maintains the temperature quite well. But I wouldn't get too upset, if the temperature now goes below 66.7, it obviously will eventually, because of the fact that your enzymes still work below that temperature. But always useful to take notes. I take lots of notes whenever I brew. I've got books full of the stuff. And it's useful to go back to if something went wrong, if your beer doesn't taste the way you expected it, or maybe something went right. Your beer is magnificent. It's winning awards, and you always want to go back to your notes and say, okay, how did I do that? Why did it turn out that way? And that's why notes are important. So let's ask the question of what's really happening here during single infusion mashing, which I'm going to try and illustrate with this diagram. So here's a diagram of the stock pot with your bag inside. And you can see there are different zones here of temperature. And also concentration of the grain itself, because obviously the heavy grains are going to start drifting to the bottom of the pot. So at the bottom is where you tend to have the higher temperature, okay? And that's going to be in your grain bed. And as a result, you can have mostly alpha amylase activity. So that's the enzyme responsible for operating at a higher temperature, and it converts starches into more complex sugars as well as simple sugars. So it contributes both fermentable sugar and unfermentable sugar to the mix, because complex sugars cannot be fermented by yeast. So it will remain in the beer, and it will contribute to body and to flavor in the beer, the sweetness of the beer. And at your middle zone is where there's more of an equal mixture of water and grain. And that's where you're going to have mostly beta amylase activity. And that is going to create more simple sugars. And because we're aiming at a moderate temperature between these extremes, we're going to have equal amounts of beta amylase and alpha amylase working in our beer. And so we're going to have a nice combination of simple sugars, which you need in order to convert into alcohol and to create the beer itself during fermentation. But you also want some complex sugars to add body. And your pH is going to vary between 5.1 and 5.7. Again, none of these things you really need to worry about too much. The pH, for instance, you almost never have to adjust pH water unless you are using very alkaline water. So maybe you have boreal water, which is very hard water, lots of alkalinity, or you're in a municipality known for having very alkaline water. But other than that, normal mineral water or any kind of normal water you're going to use will naturally adjust to that pH, because your grains are naturally acidic. So they will acidify the mash naturally, because that's just what they do. And so it creates the best pH range for the enzymes to work. Again, beer wants to be made. I personally have never had to adjust my pH level in any beer I've made. And I've used different kinds of water for brewing. So it's generally not something you need to worry about. Okay, but I just put it in there for completeness sake. So that's really what's happening in single infusion mashing. We're not stepping different mash temperatures. We're keeping it at the one temperature. It might slowly go down, but that temperature is perfect for producing a good mix of simple and complex sugars. And because we're using well-modified grains like your pale malts, your Munich malts, and so on, there's no need to have other lower. You may have heard about protein rest and those sort of things. That's only needed if you're going to use unmodified malts. If you use corn or wheat flakes, stuff which really is quite specialist, oats. You may need other kinds of temperatures for mashing, which is more difficult to achieve with Brew-in-a-Bag. But really, the majority of ales you can possibly think of brewing, including your lagers and so on, and your hybrids, really only need a single infusion mash at most. And that is why most commercial brewers also tend to stick to single infusion mashing as well. Simple, does the job, and it's not overly complicated. Okay, then the third step is mashing out. So this is where, again, this is a smaller batch, so the picture here is not of a bucket, but essentially you're going to put your colander over the second bucket. You're going to drain the bag. So what you do is you simply lift. Firstly, you heat slowly. You first heat slowly over 10 minutes to 76. This is an optional step, by the way. You don't have to do this. I'm still a little bit skeptical as to its utility in Brew-in-a-Bag. I've experimented with both not mashing out and mashing out and raising the temperature. I'm not 100% convinced that it makes a massive difference. So this is sort of optional, this heating stage. You could skip it and rather just leave the mash in for another 10 minutes. Then I would lift the bag, right? Now again, small batch brewing is easy to lift. If imagine you're lifting at least probably about 10 kilograms with all the water in there. So just be aware if you've got like some sort of back injuries or something, just to not hurt yourself. And you're just going to gravity drain it. Let it, in other words, just until it starts just sort of dripping slowly, or a steady small stream. I mean, I don't want to stand there for 2 hours waiting for the thing to drip dry. So once you're satisfied that the majority of the water has dripped free of the bag, you lift it out, and hopefully you've put your other bucket and colander next to everything, so you're not going to make a big mess. And you're going to put the bag into the colander and let it drain freely as you do other things. And then later on, you can take everything which is drained, and before you start boiling, you can chuck in that little bit of extra liquid as well. It's just to get the maximum out of your grain. But don't get too upset about, there's still lots left. I mean, the majority of the wort you're going to be using is going to be left in the pot as you lift that bag. Okay. It's natural for us brewers to sort of feel like, well, aren't I losing out on this good stuff coming out here at the end? Maybe, but you're still brewing 19 liters of beer. So losing 100 milliliters of the stuff is not going to kill you. So don't let your natural need to sort of get the maximum out of things, affect the brew day. And here we're going to measure again. It's always measurement at each step. Here we're trying to measure our pre-boil gravity. So that's a good indication of whether you've converted enough of the starch into sugar to make the beer you're aiming at. Obviously, you can also taste, and I would recommend you tasting that wort. It should taste sweet. If it doesn't taste sweet at all, that's a problem. Okay, that might mean that your grains are very old, or you didn't hit the right temperature, or the enzymatic action was affected by maybe the alkalinity of the water or the temperature. And so if it doesn't taste sweet at all, that means you haven't converted starch into sugar. That could be a problem. Very rarely does that happen. You really have to have had a big error during mashing for that to take place. And so your pre-boil gravity is for this recipe is somewhere around 1046. Okay, gravity points, plus minus 4 points. 4 points is usually my margin of error, plus or minus. If it's more than that, I may want to think of adjusting. So if my gravity is far higher, let's say it's 1056, so it's 10 points higher, that's problematic. That's way too high. So that means that I maybe have not enough water in the beginning. So I'll add water to get to the 1046. And fortunately for you, you don't have to do the math. The math has been done for you at beginnerbrewer.com. You can go into the website, to the calculator section, and there's an adjustment tool you can use. And you can just input all the numbers, and it'll tell you how much water to use to dilute your gravity. Or opposite, if you didn't hit the number, this is more common, that you may be underneath that number. So maybe it's 1036, 10 points under. Also not great. Rather add dried malt extract at this stage. So while the wort is now at sort of 60 degrees or so, it's not boiling yet, you can again use the calculator to weigh out the right amount of dried malt extract, add it to the right gravity. So it's all very easy. And I'd rather do that than just go with whatever I find. And then you start the boil, right? Full rolling boil as depicted here. You really want a vigorous boil. Lid off, obviously, because you want the volatiles to escape. If your lid is on, you're going to get off flavors from compounds which cannot then escape your beer. When you do your hop additions, timing is obviously important because they are meant to be added at different times. Then at 10 minutes, you're going to add your Irish moss I spoke of a little bit earlier. So 10 minutes before the end. And during this boiling stage, in between your hop additions and so on, don't go and sit and watch TV. Okay, that's not a good idea. There's lots of stuff to be doing to prep the rest of your brew day. First thing you're going to start doing is rehydrate your yeast. So you're going to take if it's a dry yeast, obviously you're going to be rehydrating. You're going to take it, sterilize a jar, glass jar, put some sterilized water in it, put the yeast in there. You probably only need for a packet of yeast, you don't need much more than 100 milliliters of water. And just let it sit there. Close it up, let it sit during the boil phase. It'll naturally sort of start creating a creamy liquid. You can shake it every now and again if you want, or swirl it. And eventually you'll have this uniform creamy liquid. That's what you're going to use to pitch your yeast into your beer. And what I would do often is I would use a like a 500 milliliter mineral water bottle, because I know I crack it open and it's sterile in that sense. I would put a thermometer inside the rest of that water, just to know, because that's going to be a good proxy for what the temperature of your yeast is, right? Because it's in the same water, standing outside room temperature, so that you know what that is, because that becomes kind of important later. And you're also going to be prepping however you're going to chill your beer. If you have a chiller of some kind, you may want to make sure it's clean. The last 10 minutes or so, you're going to put it in the pot to boil it sterile. If you're using an ice bath, obviously you're going to start putting ice in whatever container you've got to chill and so on. And again, we're going to measure here at the end of the boil. So at the end of the boil, we're aiming for an original gravity of 1052. And again, you can here again adjust if it's way off. It shouldn't be. Here you may hit a higher number if you had a particularly vigorous boil and you had a lot of boil off. Then you may have need to dilute a little bit with more water. But again, a 4-point margin of error, perfectly fine. Step 5 is the Whirlpool. Remember, we're going to add Whirlpool hops. So you're going to create a Whirlpool through using a big whisk, or your brew spoon is also fine. Make it, vigorously, create a Whirlpool for about 2 to 5 minutes. Just be careful of the steam coming out of that beer. I mean, we're talking about 19 liters of very hot liquid. So you may want to wear an oven glove or something, because that steam can burn you. And when you've now really, if the Whirlpool's nicely going, and it's got a nice amount of speed going, you'll add your final hops, the Whirlpool hops. You just chuck it right into the Whirlpool, let it do its thing. Okay, so that's the Whirlpool hops. And then you're going to chill your wort. This is an immersion chiller being depicted here, but you may as well also use any other, like a ice bath. Again, you want to put your lid on, okay, if you can. In this particular picture, it's not on, but I would still try at least to cover it up so that things drifting around out there doesn't drift into the beer. So remember, wild yeast is the main culprit for a lot of infection for homebrew. And wild yeast is everywhere. It's on you. If you've got a beard, it's in your beard, it's in your hair, it's on your pets. If you live near agricultural land, it's definitely drifting around there. So it can drift into anything, right? So something as simple as just putting a sterile lid onto something can prevent wild yeast from getting in there. And quick chilling is better. Okay, there are new methods now coming out of Australia, which I've read about, where they don't chill at all, called no chill brewing. But I still prefer this because it creates clear beer. The quicker you can bring that wort down to pitching temperature, yeast pitching temperature, the more you're going to drop out even further protein. So there's several stages of creating clear beer. The first stage is making sure you have a very vigorous boil. The second stage is adding something like Irish moss to the boil. Third stage is doing your Whirlpool to gather a lot of that trube, the husks left over, the hops and so on, to the center. Next stage is quick chilling to drop out even more protein. And then the final stage will be to cold condition your beer when you ferment it. Then you are almost assured of having crystal clear beer. Okay. Just a tip here, if you're using an ice bath, add some salt. So add a good handful of salt to that ice bath. It'll make the ice bath way colder. This is also a good tip, by the way, if you're having friends over for a few beers and you've got room temperature beer. If you take a cooler, put some ice water into it with salt, you'll be surprised at how quickly you can cool down things. And then you're going to pitch your yeast, right? Sterilize everything which is going to touch this process. Yeast is very, very susceptible at this stage of the operation to any kind of infection. So you really want to sterilize everything very, very well. And you want to pitch to avoid yeast shock. Often when people pitch yeast and then they look the next day and there's no fermentation going on, it might be because of this, if you've ever experienced this. And that is because yeast is quite temperature sensitive. You're trying to reduce the difference of the wort you've just chilled to the yeast in less than 5 degrees. That's why I said earlier you want to measure the temperature of your yeast, remember? And you just do that by measuring the water left over from what you used in the yeast. And generally, it's the best possible thing to do is to pitch the yeast within 5 degrees of the wort and make sure that the wort is actually warmer than the yeast. Okay, not the other way around. Because putting yeast into slightly warmer liquid, as long as it's within 5 degrees Celsius, is the absolutely ideal way of pitching yeast. And as long as it's within that temperature range of 17 to 25 degrees, you're golden. Okay, that's you're giving that yeast, other than having rehydrated it, you're giving the yeast the best possible opportunity to quickly start fermenting. We want that because if there are any microbes in your beer, any wild yeast in your beer, and it's almost inevitably the case, you want the yeast to start outperforming very quickly. It will literally, by way of natural selection, basically kill out the competing yeasts because it is really good at fermenting fermentable sugars and quickly converting that environment into a high alcohol environment which cannot sustain microbial life. And that is really why we want a quick fermentation. Okay, so that's a good tip, is to avoid yeast shock. And then the final stage is fermenting, right? 10 to 14 days. I would recommend longer is better, right? 14 days will do you well. And you don't have to mess around with that beer. Don't go and stick it in a secondary fermenter. That's malarkey. You know, a lot of the American books out there written sort of in earlier times still call for it. I've seen it online as well. Some people still want you to put it in a secondary fermenter. That is really not supported by any kind of science. You know, people did it because commercial brewers do it, but they don't really know why. There's good reasons for commercial brewers to do it, but they are brewing thousands of liters of beer. For home brewers, you never ever have to secondary ferment in a secondary container. All you're doing is you're introducing oxygen to your beer and the risk of contamination, neither of which will produce nice beer. So I feel very strongly about it, as you might tell. But yeah, there's good reason to believe that secondary fermentation is bogus for home brewing anyway. And even the big gurus like Palmer and others who used to advocate it have now come around to saying, no, it's probably not a good idea. So you're going to ferment it for 2 weeks. Try and keep your temperature within that 16 to 26 range. To the extent that you can keep that temperature constant is really going to influence the beer's taste and the ultimate product. Lower end fermentation tends, for APA especially, work really well. It produces less fruity flavors, and it's really going to keep the flavor profile very clean, which is what we want. So if you can keep it between 16 and 18 degrees, now that's obviously a very small range, and you probably need a modified fridge or something to do that with. But if you have a cellar at home or something like that, then that's ideal. That's going to produce some very, very good beer. Now, most of the ales I've brewed commercially, I've kind of brewed at the lower end of 16, 18 degrees, and that really has helped a lot. And you're going to measure your final gravity. So again, you don't have to measure constantly, like every day. Not a good idea, because every time you open up that fermenter, you're introducing oxygen and the possibility of contamination. Obviously, you're going to sterilize any instrument you use to measure. And I would suggest measuring it maybe after 5 or even 7 days. After 7 days, it should be very close to this final gravity, if not already there, because primary fermentation only takes about 3 days at most to drop down your gravity to that point. That doesn't mean you can go bottle it, because final gravity is not the only story here. There are secondary processes which the yeast goes through with the beer in combining the flavor, in slowly changing some of the chemical compounds in the beer, and the beer itself goes through a maturation process, which needs time. So even though you may have reached final gravity, it still needs time to mature. Otherwise, you have a very green beer. It's going to taste not very pleasant. Okay. And then the least favorite part of anybody's brew day is the bottling day. So 2 weeks afterwards, you want to prime the beer, because we're going to do it naturally in this particular instance. So you're going to be cleaning and sterilizing your bottles and caps. Then you're going to measure out about 127 grams of glucose in about 200 milliliters of sterile water. Boil that for 10 minutes to dissolve the sugar and to sterilize the whole solution. That's where your secondary bucket becomes handy again, because that's now going to be your bottling bucket. So you're going to chuck that sugar solution into the bucket, and then you're going to slowly rack or siphon that beer from your primary fermenter into this bottling bucket. So whatever tubing you're going to use, put it right at the bottom of the bottling bucket inside of the sugar solution, and have it run slowly but surely in. Okay, you don't want to rush this. Why? Because you don't want to introduce oxygen at this stage. Okay, that's why you're filling from the bottom up. You're also going to be doing that when you're filling your bottles. You're going to fill from the bottom up. You want to stick that tube right down to the bottom of the bottle, fill from the bottom up. Some brewers who get very technical with their brewing might even use CO2. So they might have a little CO2 tank, which they would purge the oxygen from the bottles and the bottling bucket. You can do that. It's definitely what commercial brewers do. And that is one thing you can copy commercial brewers with is their abhorrence of oxygen. Oxygen is a killer of beer flavor at this stage. So you really don't want to get too much oxygen in at this stage. And you don't have to stir it because just by way of science, natural diffusion from low to high concentration, or rather from high to low concentration in this case, your sugar solution will just go through the beer if you let it sit just a little bit. And then you cap it and you store it for 2 weeks. Now that sugar is going to interact with the remaining yeast and it will carbonate the beer naturally for you. And because we added that amount of sugar, it will be the right volume of carbonation. It will be nice, moderate carbonation for the beer style. And in the final stage, the best stage, it's where you drink the beer, right? And if you followed all these procedures and you didn't have major upsets, you should, at the end of the day, have a very, very drinkable, very flavorsome beer, APA style. And I really hope that you're going to enjoy this beer. For the full recipe, I will be posting the recipe on the chat. So if you just stick around, I'll quickly do that. But yeah, any questions? So while I do that, while I try not to mess up everything, any questions I can be of assistance with, anything at all, please put them in the chat file, and then I can answer them as we go along. I was going to quickly put this folder here somewhere. Of course, now I can't find it. It would be like that. Okay, I'm going to start answering questions, and I'm going to try and figure out this file thing later. And I'll start at the top. First question about SAB malt. Yeah, pale malt from SA breweries is often used by many commercial brewers as well. It's of varying quality. I mean, a lot of people I know constantly, their pet hobby is to constantly complain about the quality of SA brewery pale malt. But for home brewers, it's fine. I mean, it's not the best pale malt out there. I'll say that. It's fine. But if you want to take your beer to the next level, I would rather start spending a little bit more money on things like your Weirman, your Castle malting, your Tom's Fawcett malts from England and so on. Tend to be better made, more for a craft beer in mine. But SA Brewery malt's fine to start with. It's certainly cheaper. Yeah, evaporation will depend on your height above sea, your altitude above sea level. So here in Joburg, where I'm at, water boils at around 95 degrees Celsius, not 100 like it does in Cape Town at sea level. And as a result, our evaporation is a little bit more vigorous than in Johannesburg. So yeah, I mean, it varies though between sort of 3 to 2 liters per hour evaporation. It also depends largely on the vigorousness of your boil, which does make a big difference. Okay, hope that's answered your question. Yeah, and I mean, again, the mash temperature, there's another question about your range of temperature is quite wide. At a lower end, for beta amylase to work, you need 55 degrees Celsius. That's very low. I mean, it's unlikely that your mash will ever be that low. But if something really goes wrong and it's really low, it doesn't mean it's a problem. It's still going to be enough temperature for that enzyme to work. What's more problematic is if your mash is too hot. If you go above sort of 75 degrees Celsius, that becomes problematic because most enzymes involved in conversion of starch into sugar don't operate at that temperature. And unfortunately, what happens to those enzymes is they denature. They break up into their individual amino acids. And then they are no longer enzymes. And they can't come back together again, unfortunately. It's a little bit of a Humpty Dumpty problem. You just cannot put those things back together again by lowering the temperature. Then it's too late. Then you've kind of messed it up. So rather err on the side of caution and have a lower mash than too high a mash. Okay. If you haven't added Irish moss, so a lot of people don't add Irish moss to the boil, mostly because sometimes it's not available at homebrew stores, which puzzles me deeply because that stuff is everywhere. but it's still for me the best findings. I mean, no doubt about it. If you use all the stages I mentioned, you're going to have a super clear beer. If you want to add findings before bottling, you can use something called isinglass. It's made out of fish bladders, not very appealing stuff if you think about it. Um, it can work, and there's artificial versions of isinglass, which is sort of gelatin based. I just don't like putting things like that in my bottling stage of brewing because of the contamination threat, and also the amount of protein you can actually get rid of at that stage, unless you're going to filter your beer through a micron filter, is actually quite low. And so the gains you're going to make from that, I think, is reasonably low and doesn't justify the effort of going to the trouble of doing that. What I would rather do if I didn't add Irish moss, and I realized that quick enough, let's say I forgot, I would certainly have a vigorous whirlpool on the day. I will make sure that I chill my beer very rapidly as much as I can. And then the last 5 days of your 2-week cycle of fermentation, I would take that fermenter and I would put it in the fridge. So chill down very rapidly your fermented beer to fridge temperatures, which is about 5 degrees Celsius or 4 degrees Celsius. Okay, that's called cold conditioning, which is good for ales. It's not the same as lagering. Lagering is a much slower and longer process. But for ales, if you take the last couple of days, last 3 to 5 days of fermentation, and you put it into a fridge and cold crash it to that temperature, you're going to drop out a lot of proteins as well. I would always do this, by the way, when I ferment ales. I just sometimes forget to do it, but I always try and remember. And that will remove something called chill haze. Other than just dropping out a lot of protein because of the temperature, it also removes a phenomenon called chill haze. So sometimes you will have clear beer you put into your bottle. You'll see as you rack it, oh, it's very nice and clear. Good, you know. Then you put that bottle in the fridge, and then suddenly when you pour it, it's hazy. And you wonder, like, what the hell? You know, it was nice and clear when I put it in here. That's called chill haze. It only comes out when you chill the beer. So by pre-chilling your, preconditioned beer, it almost acts as a sort of a barrier to that. And so then when you do chill your beer, it doesn't do that. Okay, so that's what I would do. Right, can one increase the grain bill? Absolutely, yeah. So you can obviously, depending on the size of the brew you want, you can increase the grain bill to come to 23 liters and so on. The only thing with most of these recipes, they're not entirely linear. So some of the ingredients don't behave linearly, so you can't just double or triple things and get the same result. So if you want to make larger batches, you can ask me and I can calculate it for you, or you can invest in some brewing software, something like Beersmith, who can do it for you at a touch of a button. So that's usually the easier way of doing it. Okay, there's a question about additives in water. Is it necessary to add additives to water? I'm not sure what you mean by that. I'm going to assume that you mean sort of salts and minerals and so on. Only if you're using RO water would you need to add additives. So if you're stripping that water to its most natural H2O, which is what RO, reverse osmosis, does, you can't use RO water for brewing. There are no minerals in it. And the minerals are vital for yeast health and for other things like the malt flavors to develop. So if you're using RO water, absolutely, you've got to construct your brew water. And there's lots of calculators online and things written on how to do that. But if you don't want to go to that sort of trouble and you just use normal mineral water or municipal water, it's more what you take out than what you put in. What you want to take out is chloramine and chlorine. So you want to put it through a charcoal filter, which is pretty good at removing those things, or you can add things called Camden tablets, which remove chlorine from water quite successfully. So there are ways of treating water to remove chloramine and chlorine. But for an APA, if you want to enhance the hoppiness of the APA, you could add sort of at most, I would say two teaspoons to a tablespoon of gypsum, food grade gypsum. So that's, I need to think of my chemistry, it's calcium carbonate, I think. And that will enhance the alkalinity of the water. It will also bring out more of your hoppy flavor. So hops interact more with alkaline compounds to enhance their hoppy flavor. So that could be something you could add to an APA. I would more often do that for an IPA though. And I would always add it to the boil water, not to the mash water. You don't want to artificially make your water more alkaline. It's going to make your mash, much more problematic. Okay, so there's another question here about sparging your grains after mashing at 66 degrees. What temperature must the water be to raise the grains to 76 degrees? Okay, so well, in Brew-in-a-Bag, obviously you're not sparging. That's one of the beauties of the system, is you don't ever have to add any additional water. Your sparge is essentially you lifting the bag out of the water. That's kind of what sparging is in Brew-in-a-Bag. If you're actually going to add water to the top of the grain bed, then you're usually sparging at a higher temperature, as you go along, because that the water is added in smaller quantities and will drop down as it is added to the larger quantity of mash water. So sparging can be anything from sort of 72 usually. I'm sort of thinking out of my head right now. I'd have to go check my notes and so on. But it's not necessary in Brew-in-a-Bag. So there is a way of sparging in Brew-in-a-Bag. You can put the bag inside of a large container like a colander and actually add water to it. But that creates problems because you'd have to start with less liquid, which would make your Brew-in-a-Bag mash less efficient because there's less contact. So it's a bit like chasing your own tail. If you try and sparge whilst using Brew-in-a-Bag, it can definitely improve the mash efficiency. I've seen it happen. I've done it myself. But because of the calculations involved in reducing the water content and so on, the ultimate goal is not to get the highest mash efficiency, but to know what your mash efficiency is so that you know how much ingredients to use next time. And unless your mash efficiency is sort of like below 60%, which is problematic, because that might mean that you're not extracting the right quantities of sugars to begin with, which will make your beer very thin and so on, or not ever reach good gravity. But if your mash efficiency is somewhere between 65 and 100%, not that you'll ever get 100%, it's fine, as long as you know what it is, because your mash efficiency will dictate how much ingredients you need to use to hit the right number. If my mash efficiency is 80% and yours is 69, you need to use a little bit more base malt to get to the same number as me. That's really the only reason I need to know that number. But the two beers are not necessarily going to be fundamentally different in quality just because the one efficiency is higher than the other. That's not really the case. Okay. In commercial brewing, very important for people to be very efficient in mashing because you're using thousands of liters of everything and tons of grain and malt. And so small percentages differences translate into massive, budgetary numbers. But for a home brewer, it's not as important. Alrighty. I finally got to the end of the questions. Thanks so much for all the questions. I really enjoy trying to help you out with them, and I hope that I've answered most of them.